Hi, my name's Ken Atkins, and I am deeply honored to be speaking to you today. My topic is Share Your Story, and I cannot imagine a more important topic at such a critical time in the history of our nation, our church, and humanity at large. If the past year showed us nothing else, it is that we each have a critical role to play in someone else's life, and that every story, every person, matters immensely. But of course, that's always been true, even when we have been too busy or distracted or frantic to notice. Since the beginning, God has been writing this amazing story of His people, their successes and failures, their faith and their faults, their blessings and their curses. He has told His people's story through kings and slaves, prophets and shepherds, priests and prisoners. When Jesus Himself walked the earth and taught His followers about what the love of God the Father and the kingdom of heaven were really like, He did so in the context of stories of prodigal sons, of lost sheep and misplaced coins, of murderous and wicked servants. And He stepped right into the middle of other stories, making the blind see, healing leprous skin, casting out demons, confronting an adulterous woman about her hidden sin. God has given each of us many gifts, and perhaps the greatest is our story, for it is in our story, that we not only find the facts of who we are, but also our dreams, our hopes, fears, and all the other people and stories that God has intertwined with our own to weave this amazing tapestry that we call life. That's why I'm so happy to have discovered this wonderful organization and the work you're doing. To me, your name says it all, Faith Inclusion Network. For without faith, our stories are just that, disjointed, salient accounts of past events, along with our personal responses to random stimuli. But faith binds it all together. My story is bigger than me because it is ultimately tied to the greatest story ever told. It's another loop in the chain, another brick in the wall of something much larger. In fact, it's part of something that's infinite and ever-growing. We love God because He first loved us, which means that each of us has value and meaning far beyond what we can see or hear. Inclusion, that means everyone, regardless of what the world says or even what you say. It's an intentional binding together of everyone and everything else. It's not dependent on your race, position, age, abilities or disabilities, belief system or self-image. You're included because you are. Your story matters because it does, along with every other story. That's true whether you believe it or not, whether you accept it or not. And that is a truth that those of us who spend time daily with those in the special needs community, we know that very well indeed. We know just how important and dynamic the stories of the people we care for really are, even if they can neither speak them or maybe even personally acknowledge them. That's why I wrote my book, The Silent Son. It's about my life as a single parent raising my special needs son. To tell his story and how that story completely changed mine. And how our stories are just two more in an ongoing epic tale of how God uses the least of us to do great things that affect innumerable others. So perhaps I should tell you a little bit about my story, about how I came to be speaking to you today. I'm the father of a 28-year-old son, Danny. He has Angelman syndrome, which is a genetic defect that manifests as severe cognitive disability, lack of speech, incontinence, and an inability to walk without assistance. Basically, Danny functions as a very active and happy nonverbal 2-year-old. He has no significant health issues and requires no extraordinary care like feeding tubes or respiratory therapy. He sees a doctor only for his annual checkups. His only long-term health issue is a seizure disorder that only presents when his health is otherwise compromised with something like strep throat or the flu. When Danny was born, we had no idea there was anything wrong until his 6-month checkup, where he failed many of the developmental milestones that he should have reached. Our doctors assured us that he was probably just a late bloomer. When he showed little progress at his 1 year checkup, suddenly everyone was convinced and concerned that something was wrong, but no one knew exactly what it was. And so they just hung the wide-ranging diagnosis of cerebral palsy on him. We continued to travel to specialists and do all sorts of genetic testing, racking up thousands of miles on our van and going through literally tens of thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket medical expenses along the way. We finally got the correct specific genetic test, which gave us the answer we had for so long been desperately seeking, but did not want to hear. The prognosis was not at all hopeful for a cure or even significant improvement. Ironically, Danny was 20 months old when we received the diagnosis, and 20 months, and all these years later, he still functions basically developmentally at 20 months. Now, there have been some major developments in things like CRISPR technology and other genetic modifying treatments in the past few years, but they may offer Danny the possibility of one day being able to speak or walk or even care for himself. But many years ago, God showed me the truth about Danny, which changed everything. Danny is exactly the person God created him to be. He has his own abilities as well as disabilities. He has his own story, even though he can't speak it. And most importantly, he has his own God-given plan for his life. And he's living it. He has had tremendous impact on so many people that we have encountered over the years: doctors, therapists, teachers, teachers' aides, fellow students, and just people in the church lobby and the neighbors we encounter on our daily walks. But his greatest impact has been on me and his sister, because God has spoken clearly time and time again through him to my deepest fears, doubts, and hopes. When Danny was 9 years old and his sister was approaching her 8th birthday, their mom left and our lives simultaneously exploded and imploded. We were living in Georgia at the time, but I knew there was no way I could raise these kids on my own, so I headed back to my hometown in North Texas, where I still had some family and a lot of friends who could offer support. I returned to Texas with no money, no place to live, brokenhearted, angry, and battling depression by drinking heavily every night. The roller coaster ride of bad decisions and their consequences that I drug my little family through over the next decade could fill a book. Actually, it did. But even with all my mistakes and missteps, God never gave up on us. He mercifully closed doors that needed closed and opened ones that I anxiously stepped through, grumbling incessantly all on every step of the way that this wasn't what I had in mind. This isn't what I had planned. I was like so many of the Israelites on their desert trip from Egypt to the Promised Land. I appreciated the help, but I was really hoping for an easier route. But through this often difficult journey, I learned what real love and perseverance look like. Now, many people who knew me back then would say, well, yeah, that's what you showed your kids, but they missed the point. The love and faithful care I'm talking about is what God showed me, primarily through Danny. Danny was the constant force, an unchanging anchor in all of our lives, no matter how many bad relationships I got involved in, no matter how often I drank too much, no matter how deeply I swirled into despair and depression. Danny was still Danny, smiling his big, infectious grin, demanding my attention, giving me hugs, big, hard hugs, and pulling my hair if I lingered too long. Now, as a child, I grew up on a small dairy farm, and I knew no other life than the reality of cows and crops that and my cows particularly, they had to be milked twice a day, every day, regardless of the weather, family sickness, financial worries, or even death. I love farm life, but I hated the monotony and the inevitability of those twice daily milkings. They were the undeniable center of our family's universe. But even then, God was writing my backstory, setting the stage for the life I would face 30 years later. In 2013, on Father's Day, as I sat in the lobby of the church with Danny, well-wishers would make their way across the large sun-drenched room to give Danny a high five or a pat on the back. You know, we used to do that back before COVID. And they would drop a word of praise on me for taking care of my special son, who at the time was nearly 21 years old. Their kind words were like steely swords to my aching soul. For little did they know that I was terribly hungover from another Saturday night of drowning my sorrows and fears in one stiff drink after another. One lady delivered the deepest cut of all when she said, "I think you're the best dad I've ever known." Only if she knew the truth of who I really was, of my drinking and lying to cover that up, of the bitter tears behind my smiles, of the fear I faced daily of being found out and summarily drummed out of the church, and the opportunities to serve God that I treasured so deeply. Well, I suspect that if she knew that, or at least that's what I thought, if she knew that, it was all over. You see, I had a story, but it was one of shame, fear, regret, and despair. In fact, my greatest fear in life was someone would learn my story, and my house of cards that looked so good from the outside would come tumbling down. But God knew, and He heard my cry for help. That very morning, I met a man there in the lobby at God's insistence, because I was in no mood to meet anyone. I just wanted to get out of this terribly uncomfortable situation and get back to the safety of the bedroom Danny and I shared, where he could spend the afternoon watching SpongeBob, and I could soothe my fears with another cold, stiff drink. And so I met Patrick, a guy that I'd seen often around the church, who appeared to have the perfect life, beautiful wife, sweet kids, successful career, and a deep walk with Christ. This was exactly the type of person I avoided. His life seemed to be the exact opposite of my messy reality. Patrick told me that he and his wife were bringing a program to our church called Celebrate Recovery, a Christian-based 12-step program that went far beyond just helping people overcome addictions to drugs and alcohol. It was aimed at our, quote, hearts, habits, and hang-ups. Well, that's a pretty inclusive collection, I know, because I had many of all three categories in my recovery to-do list. In Celebrate Recovery, we tell newcomers that we don't have a quick fix, a miracle pill, or a guaranteed set of strategy to get your life out of the ditch that you have chosen to drive into often, again and again. All we have is the love of Christ and the support of people who are walking the same road that you're traveling. The steps that we take are the same ones that you will find at AA or Narcotics Anonymous, but our guiding principles are based on the Beatitudes. One of our main scriptures is Revelation 12:11, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. This is really why I'm speaking to you today. It's why I wrote my book. Every good gift we have in this life comes from God. And the him that's referred to in this scripture is identified in verse 10 as Satan, which it further identifies as, quote, the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night. Every one of us has made mistakes in life, some of them in outright defiance of God. For many of us, the mistakes are our story. We stand next to Satan as he accuses us before God, nodding in agreement, ashamed and filled with unworthiness. Not only unworthy of God's love, but the love of our friends and family. But that's not God's way. We're his children, and even though he may occasionally correct us and discipline us to get us back on the right path, the undeniable truth is he sent his son to die for us, to atone for our sins, to make us worthy. He did that in spite of our sinfulness. Actually, he did that because of our sinfulness. And once we accept that and commit our lives to seeking His will daily, God no longer sees the many imperfections and disabilities of our lives. He sees us as a pure reflection of Christ's holiness and sacrifice. Well, that's nice, but what has that got to do with telling my story? And more significantly, what's it got to do with my life serving another person with special needs? Those are inspiring scriptures, but how do they affect my day-to-day life caring for my son, and how do they impact his story? Through the past 7.5 years in Celebrate Recovery, I've seen God mend broken hearts, reclaim broken spirits, reunite broken families, break chains of addiction and bad behaviors. And every bit of that was accomplished through the relationships formed in small share groups, where desperate people found peace, safety, and acceptance to let down their guards, to come out of their closets, to come out of their safe places and out of their isolated existences and share their deepest hurts and fears. By telling our stories honestly, sometimes for the first time ever, we have found that not only were we not alone, and that we weren't the only people who had these problems, we found that there was not only grace, but actual love and acceptance out there if we were just bold enough to step away from the accuser's side and be honest and vulnerable. Now, I grew up in a family of storytellers, and I know the power of stories to elate, educate, and inspire others. But I never fully appreciated the value of them in healing us spiritually and emotionally, both for the person telling the story and the ones hearing it. I never appreciated that until I sat in a small room with a handful of other men who had come to admit that their lives had become unmanageable and that only God could fix them. We were brutally honest and open because as we shared, the Holy Spirit took our hearts and our minds and covered them with the peace that passes all understanding. For so many years, I hid my story from the world, perpetuating a false story, a myth, basically a lie, that I had it all together and that I would make any sacrifice for my special needs son and his sister, who had her own set of special needs as she navigated her tween, teen, and young adult years. I was good at living that story, that fake reality, as evidenced by the admiration and accolades I received from those I encountered at work, at my kids' school events, and even at church. But my heart was rotting inside. That's why your work is so important. When I began writing this book 8 years ago, which was before I discovered Celebrate Recovery, and while I was still in the depths of my struggles with alcohol and depression, I began to take special note of the conversations and stories I would hear when a group of parents and caregivers of children and adults with special needs would get together. Over and over again, I heard the same laments about isolation, leading to loneliness, leading to despair. Often the sadness wasn't for the caregiver's isolation, but for that being experienced by the person for whom they were responsible. The caregivers didn't speak of their own disappointment, but of their fears that they weren't doing enough to provide a full and complete life for their charges. These people desperately need a place to share their stories and give voice to those who can't speak for themselves. Without exception, the caregivers would relate their own life situations with hesitancy and palpable sadness. But if you ask them to talk about the person they were taking care of, they would suddenly perk up and tell you about all the amazing, wonderful things that person was doing and achieving. Over the years, when I've spoken to church groups and children's ministry teachers, the question that always comes up is, how should we treat these people who come into church in a wheelchair or on crutches or who are nonverbal, whose behavior is unpredictable and often disruptive? My answer is always to treat them just like you would any other newcomer. Be open, accepting, and genuinely happy to see them. Ask questions, and then, most importantly, listen to the answers. As a parent of a child with special needs, I can attest to the hesitancy and the nervousness that a caregiver will feel when introducing the person whose life and happiness depends on our decisions We don't introduce them into a new environment lightly. The best way to navigate new waters is to have someone who knows the way take me by the hand and lead us patiently and purposely. That starts with conversation, with an interest in hearing my story, my son's story, and with a greater emphasis on my son's particular interests and needs than on the programs and facilities the church has to offer. Now, that may sound simplistic and self-evident, but the reality is that those two things are seldom true in first encounters, or often second encounters. Sometimes the conversation never gets there, and I end up feeling once again that Danny and I are a couple of square pegs trying to be forced into round holes. And actually, the usual result is that there are no square holes for us, and there are no plans for any in the current budget. And so it becomes easier to just go somewhere else or go home and avoid all this stress. And that's where the enemy, Satan, the accuser, wants to keep us isolated, hopeless, down and out of the mainstream. In the early days of the COVID-19 epidemic, I found it interesting that the world at large was bemoaning the realities of social distancing and the loss of so many social opportunities to gather with our friends, family, and neighbors. Even churches were closed. And there was a great hue and cry about the damage, the emotional and spiritual damage that these separation orders is going to bring to society. It was certain to bring it. Well, I wrote in my blog, welcome to our world. We in the special needs world know all about social distancing and staying away from others. When you have someone in your care that can't be trusted to not act inappropriately or make disruptive noises or grab somebody in a death grip by their hair or their arm, it's just easier to shelter in place and stay stress-free in your own home. We can give you 100 good reasons to not subject the person we're responsible for to the pitfalls of the world at large. But along the way, we miss out on being a part of the greater story God is writing. That's a loss for my son, and it's a loss for the world out there who could benefit from his story. We must be intentional about welcoming this vital community back into the fold and into the world. We do this by developing one-on-one relationships with them and encouraging them to share their stories, first with us and then with others in an ever-enlarging circle of safety and influence. My prayer is that as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has upset everything about church, from how we gather to worship, to how we reach out to those who are fearful to come out of isolation, to how resources are allocated, that in the rebooting process, churches make a more intentional effort to reach this large and ever-growing world of people with special needs and their caregivers. In this wonderful conference, you will hear many great and creative ideas to bring these communities together. But for me, it all starts with a story. One person talking to another person. When I was going through recovery, the most important thing I did was get honest about who I really was, then have the faith and confidence to share that with another person. Overcoming my fear and pride by replacing that with trusting God and trusting Him to be faithful in His promises. A couple of weeks before this past Christmas, I became one of the millions of Americans to come down with COVID-19. For nearly 2 weeks, I lay in my bed in the basement apartment of my daughter's house where Danny and I live. Fortunately, he had gone to Atlanta to spend Christmas with his mom, so I didn't have to worry about infecting him, and I also didn't have to worry about his daily care, which I'm not sure I could have done because I had a total lack of energy. In fact, for at least 2 nights, I laid in that bed, staring out the window, wondering if I would see the sun come up. The coughing was nonstop, and I was so weak and lifeless that I couldn't sit up or even find a better position for my aching body. I did decide that I would not go to the hospital unless my breathing became much more labored, as I was afraid if I ever went in the hospital, I would never come out, I would never see my son again, and I would never get to hold my 3-week-old granddaughter again. But even the very real fear I faced during that time wasn't as debilitating or despairing as the incredible sense of isolation I felt. My daughter and son-in-law and granddaughter were just upstairs from me. I could hear them. I could hear her crying and her parents rushing about at all hours of the day and night to meet her needs. I could hear their dogs racing around and barking at the unending line of delivery men and women who seemed to come to our door at all hours of day and night. They were all right there, but they might as well have been 1,000 miles away because I was quarantined and too toxic to even be in the same room with them. I became deeply depressed and found myself drifting into old habits of despair, self-pity, and hopelessness. This was so reminiscent of my pre-recovery days when I felt like I was drowning in the needs of my special son and my equally special daughter and my own not very special at all hurts, habits, and hang-ups. And then on the morning after Christmas, I woke up with a little less coughing, a little more energy, and a little more appetite, and a determination to use all the wonderful gifts I had received from God, the gift of health, the gift of family, the gift of an amazing story that God has been writing on my life since I was a kid, wandering around in the pasture cursing those cows that I hated milking, to bring people out of their funks and their emotional fortresses, to hear their amazing stories and show them how their stories intersected with mine and with God, to bring hope to the hopeless and give voice to the voiceless. So thank you for all you do and all you've been doing for so many years to achieve these same goals. You are an answer to prayer. I know because I've been praying for some group like this for years and had no idea there was one already in place doing amazing things for God and His precious special ones. Parents and caretakers and children and adults with special needs do have an amazing story to tell. And they need to tell it because of the peace and sense of acceptance it inevitably will bring them, and because those outside of our special world need to hear those stories so that they will better understand that these, quote, different people really aren't that different after all. We all need to be valued. We all need to be accepted. We all need to be loved. That's been God's plan for His children all along. That's been His gift to us since He started writing this amazing story. May God bless this organization and the world-changing story that it is helping to write. Thank you.